A soft metallic click cut through the stillness of Rarity's showroom, followed immediately by a faint clockwork rattling. Flat hissing broke out as the needle was lowered onto the edge of the vinyl record, and shortly after, the thin tones of a slow, trilling violin crescendo began. It echoed throughout the room. Rarity smiled and trotted away from the gramophone. A new model painted in deep black and bright gold. Behind it, a line of long, flat boxes leaned up against a wall, holding all of the mirrors she had brought, which were now waited to be mounted to the shop. A massive desk has been placed in the middle of the room, easily 3 times the size of her old one. It was heavily laden at one end with a heavy cloth in varying shades of bright blue, pink, and purple. Having to spend another morning visiting Fluttershy, Rarity was eager to get to work. At the other end of the desk perched a brand new industrial-grade sewing machine. It was the top of the line, ordered directly from the manufacturer in Manhattan, and its red paint gleamed in the light from the chandeliers overhead. Even though it was a mid-afternoon, and Rarity had finally torn down and thrown out the massive, hideous curtains that had suffocated the windows, she needed to light all of the lamps to get enough energy to light the work by. Around her, 6 huge swaths of fabric had already been hung from the ceiling, creating the first partitions of the showroom and showcasing the vast empty space left in the ceiling. Rarity hoped she wasn't dueling herself, but she thought the place had already decidedly more warm and welcoming. Although the warmth could be just from the lights. Rarity, though, letting out a sigh and fanning herself lightly with a stray bit of fabric. Even though they had only been burning for a few hours, the lamps had managed to rise the temperature inside considerably. She would need to be careful not to let it get too hot and stuffy inside after opening, and she wondered if a few skylights might not solve the problem of the shop's abominable dimness, at least during the daylight hours. Like the rest of the exterior, however, it was a problem that couldn't be solved until spring, and she knew that she would just have to soldier through it. Stepping up to the desk, she started to work on a floor pedal with the hind hoof, and then the machine rattled to life as she fed more fabric into it. She had spent the past few weeks measuring and creating patterns for the interior while she waited for the materials to arrive, and she hoped to have the entire showroom decorated by the end of the month. The sewing equipment would soon be moved up to the bedroom eventually, but for now she wanted to be in the middle of everything, as it looked shape around her. A heavy hoof pounded on the door behind her, and Rarity let the sewing machine slow to a halt again. Speaking of getting everything decorated, she thought excitedly. She trotted to the front door, the thin echoes of the gramophone's sympathy accompanying her, and opened it to find Pegasus stallions in blue, badly rumped uniforms facing her. Behind them were 2 large carts full of several wooden crates. "Miss Rarity," one of them asked. "At your service," Rarity replied with a smile. "We have a delivery from you from Philadelphia Clover's suppliers," he said, giving her a clipboard and quill. "If you wouldn't mind signing for us, we can bring them to you." "Of course," Rarity said, taking the proffered sheet with her magic and spinning it out of her name in dark, elegant swirls. "Please bring them to the main floor room here, if you be so kind, over there, where those other boxes were." "You got it, ma'am." A few seconds later, the crates had been taken, pried into pieces with crowbars, and the Duchess removed to be behind 12 Palestine Ponequin dress from forms made from bone-white cloth, ready to hold in peg progress pieces and model new designs on the showroom floor. "Thank you for your trouble," Rarity said, tipping them several gold bits as they trotted out the door. "Not at all, ma'am," he replied, tipping his hat to her. "You have a nice day." Rarity closed the door and trotted back to the table. As the old recording of the violins continued to play, Rarity started having the sewing machine and continued fashioning the next of the huge wall hangings that were transforming in the showroom. Somewhere nearby, a faint muffled thump reached her ears. Rarity slowed the machine and glanced up briefly, wondering if something had fallen from a shelf in her bedroom. With a shrug, she resumed her work, almost immediately. Whatever it was, it had not sounded like it had been broken. Rarity's ears twitched as she stopped the machine again. She had the unpleasant idea of the sounds reminded her of someone trying to sneak through the staircase when they thought they couldn't be heard, experimentally. She started the machine and watching her work carefully as ever while her ears scanned the room for any sign of sounds. The thread was then dragged faster and faster through the twisting metal spines and wheels of the machine until it was nearly at full speed again. Rarity let out a breath that she hadn't realized she had been holding a satisfied sigh. The machine spun into halt, and Rarity looked up sharply towards the kitchen. That was the sound of the basement door. She was sure of it. Frustration overriding her apprehension, she strode back to the alcove and into the kitchen, frowning as she sought out the source of the sound. Sure enough, the basement door, coated with the sickly gray paint that had flaked with age. It was hanging ajar by a few inches. It opened to the thick, imperturbable darkness of the cellar. With a roll of her eyes, she pushed it shut and rattled it briefly to make sure the latch had caught. Without another glance of it, Rarity walked back to the showroom and started up the sewing machine with an exasperated sigh. Almost as if she had settled down, however, she felt tense and restless. The music and the clean, repetitive clatter of automatic switching had slowly hollowed around her, unheard by any pony else, and yet she felt as if someone, same as with her mother, would come around and just watch her work. She had never been able to stand it when ponies watched her work. It made her feel paranoid, as if every move she made was being judged for perfection before she had the chance to really make something shine. As a result, she would never show an unfinished piece to anyone if she could help it. She held up another length of cloth and scrutinized it, but her attention kept wandering. Her eyes moved to the record player or the black alcove. She looked around angrily, but no one was watching her. She was alone. Then, just as she felt she might be getting back into the groove, she heard the increasingly familiar sounds of the basement latch opening once again, this time followed by the faint, creaking progress of the door's hinges. With a frustrated groan, she threw the fabric down again and stepped away from the table. All the distractions had finally broken with her momentum. If I can't get the ball rolling on anything else is redecorated, I'll just have to find some other way to be productive. She walked back to the kitchen with a huff and fixed her eyes on the basement door. It had drifted open wider this time. Several inches from the darkness behind it was now visible. Rarity's frown deepened as her heartbeat quickened slightly. The sense of watchfulness seemed to intensify. She felt like something that could be looking at her just from the inside of that doorway. She was surprised to know how deeply she thought was unsettling her. She walked carefully towards it, but nothing moved in the deep darkness behind it, not even when she let her horn and pushed through the smallest amount of extra light behind the door. Then an idea occurred to her. I've been meaning to have a look at the artwork that got left behind. It was possible she might have been making some use of it to decorate the shop, and who knew, there might even be old and rare prints hidden away down there. Although that's hardly likely in an old ponytail public office, she thought as she swung the door fully open. The stairs fell away to the left and dissolved into thick, inky darkness. As she laid one hoof on the dry, naked boards, she felt a strange sensation of trespass, as she reminded of when she had come home and found her door locked against her. There was nothing visibly amiss, and yet still she couldn't shake the impression that there was something else present down in the light that didn't reach. It was the kind of heaviness in the air that gave her the sense that darkness was not quite empty, and no amount of shadow could completely hide the anomaly. The blue light from her horn snatched the gas valve at the top of the stairs before the idea could drive her away. As the thin sigh of the gas became audible, she grimaced with effort as she switched from levitation to summoning a tiny snap of flame from nothing. The tiniest snick around the front of her was a brief flash of yellow and blue dazed of her eyes, but the darkness swallowed it and stood later. She gritted her teeth and pushed harder. She grunted in frustration as another spark snapped and vanished without a result. She was about to give up and grab the matches from the stove across the kitchen when a third spark finally caught the gas and a pale flame sprang to life. To her dismay, the feeble light barely pushed back the darkness engulfing the stairs. It didn't even reveal the next sconce at the bottom. With a roll of her eyes, she intensified the simple light from her horn and darted downward. The darkness yielded grudgingly before her, only to shake around the edges of her light to close in behind her. Her hoofsteps echoed in the empty room ahead of her, announcing her presence. After what felt like so many steps, the sconce at the bottom of the stairs faded into view, and she ignited with a relieved sigh as she stepped into the freezing floor. Muted colors and poorly defined shapes fading into place over the flat emptiness as a little space came into view. There were no other lamps, but she thought she had enough to go through the artwork. This basement smelled slightly damp and musty, and there was a strange dense smell beneath it. Rarity couldn't quite place. She could pick up out the faintest hint of a natural tangy pine, almost masked by something that smelled like a combination of something burnt mixed with wet leaves. She briefly reminded of the dark and narrow path in the Whitetail Woods, but unlike the clear, clean smell of damp foliage, this was murkier, muddled with the almost chemical mire that made her wrinkle her nose. She spotted the mass of haphazardly stacked canvases at once, a tilted pile compromised with the white edges and pale brown frames. She hadn't really paid much attention to them during the tour, so she was surprised when she realized how many were there. The basement was actually larger than she had originally thought, but the canvases crowded the space until almost nothing was left. I'll probably end up donating most of these, she thought numbly, as she stepped forward and lifted the first canvas. At first glance, the scene appeared to be a rather nice pastoral with heavy saturated greens, blues, and whites. Startling clear in the dim light of the basement, the painting seemed to be of Ponyville Park, and Rarity thought she recognized the mountain featured prominently in the lower third. She was already thinking about placing it somewhere upstairs when a spot of fiery red eye caught her eye. She looked closer and saw a trail of vibrant crimson seeping away from the fountain. It seemed to bleed from a figure that she didn't notice there before, an insemated equine figure with one hoof crooked around the edge of the fountain, peering out as if it trying to get a clearer view of the painter. Rarity scowled in surprise and distaste and laid the painting aside. She picked up more and more, however. Her aversion had turned into a nauseating disgust. Most of the paintings were a bizarre mix of surreal and macabre, featuring elements of disturbing organic geometry. Dismissal horizons, obliterated landscapes, and disfigured monstrous equines. In some scenes, desiccated bodies that barely resembled ponies crowded against the walls and cliffs, and their alien jaws stretched painfully wide as their white eyes stared out of the canvas. In the others, she seemed to look through the window in another world where ponies strode over the burned plains with the limbs too long, too numerous to their disproportional bodies, infected with the strange plant-like growths. There were pale, disembodied faces hovering over the skies, skin drawn tightly by the mouths hung expressions of a pale sorrow, as her eyes started to say something that Rarity didn't see. Almost against her will, Rarity kept looking through the paintings. If she hadn't been at the shop or gallery, she would have moved on from the appalling scenes in search of something more pleasant. But her mind was caught in a kind of trace in a maniacal, morbid curiosity, just to see how strange the next painting could possibly be, and they never disappoint. Ghastly doll-like foals whose bodies were infinitely too small for their enlarged, grotesque heads, with black eyes into mirrors that reflected nothing. Brutally wounded mares dragged mangled bodies of overtarians of bone, with their scarcely recognizable faces turned to the heavens in frozen screams of unimaginable agony. A carnival scene that seemed to have been sculpted from the molten flesh that was dominated by a hellish merry-go-round, where skeletal riders had been speared out of large amount counterparts, which had been faded the text as Le Carousel des Temps on its renovating pavilion. Every painting she looked seemed to be exude any magnified and bassets and most terrible emotions Rarity knew. Terror, sadism, machinism, malice, utter loneliness, and even the most settling of all, the occasional twinge of indestructible, venereal excitement. It provoked the same raw, intertwined forms. But even in the face of that, there was something disconcertingly tragic about seeing the scenes. It was almost as if being given the form they kind of found had permission to exist, an acceptance of all cruelty and privation. The world was burdened with that Rarity didn't want them to have. Rarity found that she was breathing harder than normal. She felt terrified and unfrailed at the same time. The dense air seemed to press on her. The flame on the wall behind her danced and shivered as if it was being suffocated, and it cast wildly animated shadows around the room. Rarity turned over the final canvas, and the sun normally of what she saw, contrast with all the lurid scenes she had almost been climbing to, sent a fresh wave of horror through her, what turned into her stomach and shrank in her vein every fresh. In the next instant, she found herself couldn't imagine why it would make her feel so. It was a simple, if grim, portrait of a perfectly normal-looking pony. She was an earth pony with a pink coat and pale, beautiful blue eyes. She had the kind of same rare multicolored mane and tail as Rarity only seen a few times, even on the fashion catalogs. Her mane was yellow, dark pink, and orange, while her tail was more of a muted scheme of purple, blue, than teal. Her body was entangled with ease, and now was positioned beside her, although her face was turned into the painting's viewer. She held a long, thin, crimson brush in her right hoof, and then there was a mirror in the dark red frame behind this, which she curiously showed a reflection from the pony would be in the wrong angle. Rarity realized that there might have been another mirror positioned exactly where Rarity would have been standing had she hadn't been in the scene. Rarity then tilted her head, a slight frown settling on her face as she looked down on the scene. After the scene and shock had worn off, something about the image was chilling and curiously melancholic. The mare's face was a fixed expression of calm and concentration. Her eyes narrowed at the jaws set a thin downward curl as she focused on what she was looking at, which Rarity realized it must have been the mirror she had used to paint herself. And yet there was something in those eyes Rarity didn't like, the sense of barely concealed revulsion or hatred for the object of the pony's gaze. As she pushed the painting away, she noticed a tiny plague of gray metal tacked into the bottom of the simple square frame. As she looked closer, she could make it out that said, "Farewell, self-portrait, TRCE 966. The inscription puzzled Rarity, as one of the other paintings had been labeled in any way. She was struck again with a sense of vague familiarity, but couldn't place its sources. Those eyes seemed to stare out of the oiled canvas, cold and challenging, and their intensity finally broke Rarity's reverie and gave her cause to lay the painting aside. As if released from a spell, Rarity stacked the paintings back up, making certain that none of the art would be visible. Nevertheless, she couldn't help but handle them with some kind of reverent care, making certain not to damage them. "I'd think I'd burn the shop down and hang any of these on my walls. Still, an artist never stops to disrespecting some pony else's hard work and creative vision." She self-piled them, and she had found out before extinguishing the lamps and heading back to the showroom. Instead of going straight to the table, she went to one of the tall windows and looked out the road beyond. The sight of muted daylight in the ordinary snow-burdened houses and streets outside calmed her, and she took a few deep, measured breaths as the oppressive atmosphere of the basement faded. She couldn't imagine who would have kept such ghastly and disturbing art, and she didn't really need to care to find out. The only problem was that she couldn't think of who in Ponyville would be willing to take a collection like that off of their hooves. At least it's out of the way, she thought. I don't need the cellar space right now, so it's probably best just to leave it. There are no more important things to take care of first. As she watched the quiet street outside, her attention was caught by the distant shape of a pink earth pony, leaving the market and heading down the road towards her. The memory of her first dark night in that place and the figure she had seen advancing on her from outside came back from form of the corner of her mind, where she had almost managed to forget about it. It was followed quickly by the mental glimpse of a portrait of the grim, pink earth pony lying in her basement. That's what the portrait reminded me of, she thought with a soft gasp, but she had no time to consider the connection. As a moment later, she recognized a distinct mountain of purple hair balanced atop the pony's head. The tension on her back released as she slumped and breathed a sigh of relief. Mother! As her mother drew near, Rarity went over to the door and opened it, before it became unnecessary for her mother to knock. As she did, Rarity noticed the full carrier slung at her mother's side and heard the soft little grunts and moans from Sweetie Belle fussing inside. "Oh, there you are," her mother said, bursting into a huge grin as she saw Rarity. "I stopped earlier, but no one answered. It's been a while since we heard from you, so I thought I'd pop by for a short visit." "I'm terribly sorry. I was out visiting Fluttershy," Rarity replied. "I hope you didn't take the time out of your schedule just for me." "Oh, don't be silly," she replied cheerfully, edging closer to the entrance. "I was a little miffed when I stopped by the first time because I could have sworn I saw you through the window, and I couldn't help but think you might be avoiding me. But it's good that you got to spend time with your little friend." "Little?" Rarity thought with a slight scowl. "You wouldn't get to do that in a big town like Manhattan, would you?" her mother continued. "I'm so glad you were able to find something here at home. Do you mind if I come in for a little bit? It's cold out here." "Not at all, please," Rarity said, suppressing a groan. She could see where this was going, and the idea of a long visit was not palatable to her after all the other distractions she had allowed so far. "Goodness, it's stuffy in here," her mother continued, as she continued to follow Rarity inside. "No wonder with all those lamps burning in the middle of the day. What in Christia do you need all those for?" "It does get a bit close," Rarity admitted, speaking a little louder over Sweetie Belle, who seemed to be getting fussier. "The light really isn't good, and I need a lot of it to work. I've been trying to get things done all day, you know," she said with a sidelong smile, hoping her mother would take the hint. "Once winter wraps up is over, I'm sure I'll be able to do something about getting more natural light in here." At that point, Sweetie's fussing escalated in a full wail. "Oh, wow, now, what's the matter, little sweetie?" her mother cooed, pulling her out of the carrier and sitting out with her on Rarity's lawn sofa. Rarity's smile became strained as she glanced at her desk, piled high with unfinished hangings. "Perhaps she wants to go home, Mother," she suggested. "I doubt she enjoys being out on the old cold much." "Oh, she's just fussy because she's tired, aren't you, sweetie?" her mother replied. "It's okay. Don't you want to visit with your big sister? You haven't seen her in so long." "I visited last week," Rarity grumbled, but her mother didn't seem to notice. Sweetie only responded with a wail that was louder than anything Rarity had ever heard from before. "Really, Mother, I don't wish to be rude, but I have so much to do, and she seems like she wants to be taken care of." "Oh, she'll calm down soon," her mother said with a dismissive wave. "You go ahead and do your thing. I can listen to you from here. I want to hear all about the things have been going for you. Do you know I was just in the library the other day when I told Miss Dog-Ear that you've moved into the old town hall? I thought she was going to faint. Apparently she never thought any pony would make anything of this old place again. She grew up here when this place was still in use, you know. She probably remembers what this place looked like back in the heyday. You should pop in and ask her about it. I'm sure she'll have some wonderful ideas about how to make this place look grand again." "I'm sure she would," Rarity said, stepping back at the desk and looking at the fabric with loathing. Behind her, her mother prattled over Sweetie Belle's cries about who had said around that town last week. It was all Rarity could do to keep her from slamming her hoof against the desk in frustration. Her breath hissed out between her painfully clenched teeth. "Am I ever going to be allowed to get anything done?" Rarity's sleep that night was worse than it had been. Her mother had stayed for nearly 2 hours, and Sweetie Belle hadn't shut up for the moment the entire time. The entire day had been a total waste, and she had gone to bed angry with a lingering headache from Sweetie's echoing screams. She was angry at herself for getting distracted. She was angry at her mother for coming by, for bringing her stupid infant sister along, and for wasting the entire afternoon with her inane gossip. Why can't she just respect that? I have things to work on. She tried to calm herself down and tell herself that Cookie was just trying to cope with her daughter moving out, but the feelings of annoyance just kept flaring up again. I can't keep letting myself get sidetracked. I can't. They'll just have to get used to it. With a firm resolution to not to follow herself to be distracted by anything tomorrow, she finally managed to drift off into a restless sleep. Her mind lifted from one of the agitated dream to another. An orange farm pony asked her about her friend of hers and had never liked working on the house. Shadows moved slowly in a huge circular room that was filled with an acrid, earthy smell of pale flames that seemed to whisper and hiss when Rarity wasn't looking at them. She was trying to make a dress, but she kept pricking herself with a needle. The severe sliver metal was turned to crimson as it slid away from her punctured skin, and the earth pony laughed and sneered at her for her clumsiness. "You're such a lazy pants," Pinkie Pie said for the first time. "I can't believe Mimi gave this place up to someone like you." "Will you stop with the foolishness?" her mother said next. "You've wasted enough time trying to make it big somewhere else. It's no use. Can't you see that? Just stay here in Ponyville. It's safer here." "They'll never love your work," they both said, their faces fading between each other. But there was a third voice and the face there as well, but only for an instant before blending back into Pinkie's or her mother's, like thin wet paint dissolving in her water. "It's idiotic to try. You should just give up." "What?" Rarity asked, faintly becoming aware of what she was dreaming about. She struggled in that dim, formless space between the sleep and wakefulness. "What are you talking about?" She clung onto the dream, inexplicably desperate to hear what the voice had to say, before it faded into a stability of her waking mind. But it was gone. Rarity laid on the bed, the sheets twisted around her, breathing hard and her head turned to the side. Behind the sounds of her breaths, however, she noticed something else. A thin echoing wail seemed to bleed from between the fibers and the floorboards to rise the vaulted ceiling like the smoke. It was coming from downstairs. Rarity rose and all drowsiness was gone. The clouds obscured in the moonlight, and only the faintest, the most muted shade of gray permeated the room, revealing the misty forms that coiled into the walls and furniture. She opened the bedroom door, and the volume of cries increased. The echoes distorted them, and they wavered between the sounds of a child and those of an adult. And an almost animalistic sound. The stairs creaked and made her way down, guided only by the thinnest moonlight that ran over the floors and walls like water. The sound now of cry of total miserable disrepair, and has intermerged with terror, became suddenly clear as she came into the showroom. She blinked dazedly as she tried to find the source of her sound. Her mother had fallen asleep on the couch, and the wall hangings Rarity had worked so hard were piled on the floor. Someone had taken them down. "Mother?" Rarity thought with a groan. She looked at the desk at the center of the room. She was startled to see the shapeless figure rolling back and forth on it as it thrashed in the air with billowing limbs. The bundle was just a source of screaming, small limbs flailing inside linens and casting fluid, shapeless shadows on the walls. Rarity's breathing became ragged, as the scene before her was somehow wrong, but she was wailing ripped through her skull and echoed off the walls to pummel her ears, drowned out in any capacity that she had fought. She had the impression of the same scene before her was faintly distorted, like she was seeing it through the rippling haze of summer heat. But the room was as cold as the winter night outside, and the ripples did not move. She stepped forward sluggishly. Her legs felt like they were moving through thick, clingy paste. "Make it stop," she fought. She seemed to leak from her mind and murmur through the room, stealing between the beams above, slithering over the floor and around her hooves, and tickling the sensitive skin of her neck as it climbed back down towards her. Rarity had heard the whisper echo back to her, as if it were molten silver trickling hostily onto her ears, a deadly heat seeping into the base of her skull. "Make it stop!" A sudden urge of anger and frustration swelled in her chest, and she scowled, her vision clouded with dark, aimless hatred. Another wail assaulted Rarity's senses, and she staggered. The scene before her seemed to pulse as once as if the surface was of a billowing sail. She blinked and gasped, feeling suddenly nauseous. The saturated stench washed over her, an earthly liquid smell that was almost floral, but immersed with the exhaling reek of something acidic and mineral so strong that it stung her tongue with the evasive flavor. She coughed, snorted, and looked up, her weary confusion written on her face. The room was quiet. The space in the center was a sewing table, clearly visible in the faint moonlight from the front windows, was distinctly bare. Rarity had snapped her head to look around at the sofa where she had seen her mother resting, but it was so empty. She was alone. Of course, she thought that her memories were returning to her lethargically. Mother went home a few hours ago. She looked barely around the room, blinking to try to clear the vicious, flamy tears sleep from her eyes. The wall hangings were back in place. Of course she didn't take them down. Why would she do that? Rarity sighed, feeling the pains of sleep-deprived headache at the beginning. It was another dream. It still lingered her drowsy memories. Like tiny glimpses of another vision of the room, were still pushing at the corners of her vision. She felt dizzy and sick. Her bed called so strongly for her to care about the showroom or any dreams, just as long as they went away and finally allowed her to sleep. Her legs dragged like dead weights as she pulled herself up the stairs and back to bed. She lay there for some time before the pounding in her head slowly subsided and her exhaustion finally pulled her back to sleep. What's up, my pretties? It's the Lion Queen here. I want to appreciate you all for tuning into this video, and I do appreciate you guys supporting my video by giving this video likes and stuff. If you really enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, comment and subscribe if you're new, ring the bell for notifications to when I upload so that way you guys will get updated for whenever I upload. If you want to follow me on Twitter or DeviantArt, feel free to leave a follow on those if you are interested in following me on those socials. If you want to support my backup channel, known as Miss Dark Shigo, feel free to subscribe to it, as a link to that will also be in the About page section. And with that being said, and that being the case, thank you so much for watching, my pretties, and as always, please stay pretty.